Good evening, I'm Farhana Sheikh. Here are our top stories for tonight. Thailand-Cambodia fighting spreads along contested border, and Ukraine to share revised peace plan with US on Tuesday. All that and more coming up on AWANI International. Our top story for tonight, renewed fighting between Thailand and Cambodia is spreading along their disputed border. At least 7 Cambodian civilians and 3 Thai soldiers have been killed, bringing the death toll from the latest clashes to 10. Cambodia's former Prime Minister Hun Sen says his country retaliated after Thai forces launched strikes. Thailand, however, says it is moving to expel Cambodian troops from what it calls its territory. Now, the violence marks the most serious confrontation since 5 days of fighting in July, which left 48 dead and forced hundreds of thousands from their homes. Each country is blaming the other for triggering the latest round of clashes, which has derailed a fragile ceasefire brokered by Malaysia and the US in October. US President Donald Trump and Malaysian Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim have urged both sides to exercise restraint and honor the agreement. Meanwhile, to ease tensions. Following heavy fighting in July, Trump warned both countries that negotiations on reduced US tariffs would be suspended unless the violence ceased. Ukraine is set to present a revised peace plan to the White House later today after President Volodymyr Zelensky held talks with leaders of France, Germany and the UK. Now, Zelensky says the plan has been cut from 28 to 20 points, though there is still no agreement on any territorial concessions to Russia.
Kyiv remains under pressure from Washington to accept a peace deal that has been viewed as favorable to Moscow. An earlier version of the US-backed plan proposed handing full control of the Donbas to Russia, even though Kremlin forces have not managed to capture it after nearly 4 years of war. Zelensky has maintained that any change to Ukraine's borders must be decided by a public referendum. Ukraine is currently facing one of its hardest periods in the war. Russian troops are advancing in the east, and cities and towns are enduring hours of power cuts amid heavy strikes on the energy grid and other critical infrastructure. US President Donald Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff and son-in-law Jared Kushner brought a revised plan to Moscow last week before holding days of talks with Ukrainian officials in Miami. Those discussions ended on Saturday with no breakthrough.
That's our top news for tonight. More coming up after this break.
Belum tukar box lagi ke? Sebab nanti dah tak boleh nak stream on demand. Tak ada kontrak. Pasang pun percuma. Boleh menang barangan perkakas rumah dan pelbagai hadiah menarik.
Astro Ultra Box ni sangat senang digunakan sebab walaupun hujan, saya dapat menonton dengan tanpa gangguan. Saya suka stream Disney Plus dengan cucu-cucu saya.
Dengan box baru, boleh stream pelbagai aplikasi yang dah termasuk dalam pakej anda. Tunggu apa lagi? Nak menang? Tukar sekarang.
Welcome back. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will meet US President Donald Trump on December 29th to discuss the next steps in the Gaza ceasefire. According to the Israeli government spokesperson, this includes future phases of the plan and the proposed international stabilization force.
On Sunday, Netanyahu has said that the first phase of the Gaza truce is almost complete. He added that he would discuss with Trump on how to end Hamas's rule in Gaza, stressing that any ceasefire must ensure that Hamas disarm and accept a demilitarized Gaza. The ceasefire is now in its second month, but both sides continue to accuse each other of violations. Israeli strikes have persisted, with at least 360 Palestinians killed since the truce began, bringing the overall death toll to over 70,000. The meeting also comes as Trump increases pressure on Netanyahu to pursue a new security agreement with Syria, after repeated Israeli incursions and airstrikes have largely derailed previous talks.
US President Donald Trump has positioned himself as the leader who can solve the world's toughest conflicts, from Gaza to Ukraine. But how effective is his brand of diplomacy? Gregory P. Poling from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington says that Trump's America First approach may likely chase easy wins, leaving the hardest crises unresolved.
There's a clear inconsistency here in the America First approach, in which the president doesn't want to be involved in actually mitigating conflict. You know, he wants to pull the U.S. back from what his supporters might call the world police role, but he also wants to be seen as a great peacemaker. And so I think what he looks for is relatively easy wins, places where he can use some tariff leverage or where foreign governments are eager to make him happy and therefore will let him claim some credit for something. But again, the White House is not that interested in the dirty work of actually negotiating ceasefires and peace deals. The sole exception being so far Gaza, and that's because the U.S. was already so deeply involved. There was no way to just pretend that the U.S. didn't have to have a role there. Half of them, again, like the Thailand-Cambodia deal, they played a marginal role, maybe important in helping speed things up, but they're not actually there to oversee the implementation, which is why we don't see the U.S. really doing anything about the breakdown of the Thailand-Cambodia ceasefire. So those are the ones that are most transactional and where the administration is not having, I think, that big a role beyond the pomp and pageantry of it. Russia, Ukraine, and Gaza, Israel, where the U.S. is actually using its influence, again, we're seeing a mixed bag. It doesn't seem that they are actually able so far to deal with the hardest conflict in the world, which is clearly Russia, Ukraine right now.
Gregory also draws a clear distinction between Trump's diplomacy in Gaza and in Ukraine, stressing that while the former allowed for significant leverage, the latter offers much less.
So in Gaza, the U.S. had more leverage over Netanyahu and the Israeli government than any other outside party, and so could use that leverage. And the fact that Trump was both, in a sense, closer to Netanyahu than Biden had been, but also more willing to use that leverage, I think gave him the ability to move Israel into a ceasefire, which, again, is still fragile. We should be clear that the ceasefire has not moved forward in the way that people had hoped, but it is still holding. Russia, Ukraine, you don't have that leverage. Trump does not have that kind of leverage over Putin. Putin is the one who does not want peace. The U.S. clearly does have leverage over Ukraine, but only to a point. Not so much leverage that Washington can actually force Ukraine to give up its sovereignty. That combined with the fact that the administration seems, again, more focused on getting a deal than what's actually in that deal has been part of the problem. So this latest proposal, the 28-point proposal that's now been walked back and rejected by all parties, that appears to have basically been written by Russia in a way that was clearly going to be unacceptable to Ukraine and to the Europeans. And they took it to them anyway, because I think they were just so eager to say the word deal, and they didn't want to think too much about what was in it.
China's Premier Li Qiang has warned that the mutually destructive impact of global tariffs has become increasingly clear this year. Speaking to economic organization leaders in Beijing, Li said the global economy has been shadowed by tariff threats since early 2025.
The meeting brought together heads of major international institutions, including the IMF, World Trade Organization, World Bank, OECD, and ILO. He said such barriers were damaging to all sides and called for urgent efforts to reform global economic governance. He added that the impact of tariffs had been made visible through global supply chains and trade flows. China's trade surplus surpassed $1 trillion for the first time in November. A surge economists say is partly the result of U.S. tariffs diverting Chinese exports into other markets, putting pressure on manufacturing sectors worldwide. The remarks come as China navigates heightened trade frictions and seeks to position itself as a leader in emerging technologies, even as global economic governance faces growing strains from protectionism.
The United States will allow NVIDIA's H200 artificial intelligence chips to be exported to China, but only under strict conditions and with a 25% fee on each sale. President Donald Trump has announced the decision on Monday, saying it balances national security with maintaining America's lead in AI technology.
The 25% fee, higher than 15% proposed earlier, will be collected as an import tax from Taiwan, where the chips are manufactured before they are cleared for export to China. Trump added that the Commerce Department is finalizing conditions to ensure national security is protected. In his Truth Social post, he said he informed Chinese President Xi Jinping of the move and claimed the response was positive. The decision aims to avoid a complete ban that Washington fears would help Chinese firms such as Huawei to dominate the domestic AI chip market. However, some in Congress immediately criticized the move, warning that allowing H200 exports could strengthen China's military and undermine U.S. security. Several Democratic senators called the move a colossal failure, while Republican John Molinar said China would use the chips to boost surveillance and replicate NVIDIA's technology. The H200 is NVIDIA's second most advanced AI processor, and until now, U.S. export controls had barred it from the Chinese market.
U.S. President Donald Trump warns that Europe is moving in a very bad direction days after his new national security strategy criticizes the continent's migration policies. He condemns what he describes as a nasty $140 million EU fine imposed on Elon Musk's platform X, while admitting he knows little about the specifics of the case.
Look, Europe has to be very careful. They're doing a lot of things. We want to keep Europe. Europe is going in some bad directions. It's very bad for the people. We don't want Europe to change so much. They're going in some very bad directions. That was a big thing.
His comments followed the release of the U.S. National Security Strategy, which characterized Europe as over-regulated and at risk of civilizational erasure due to migration. The document said Washington would encourage internal resistance with European states to counter this direction. Tensions between Trump and European leaders have intensified over U.S. proposals to end the war in Ukraine, amid concerns in Europe that Washington intends to pressure Kyiv into conceding territory to Russia. China has accused Japan of militarily threatening Beijing after Tokyo said Chinese fighter jets aimed their radar at Japanese military aircraft, an incident Japan denounced as dangerous. Speaking during a meeting with German counterpart Johann Vadpol in Beijing, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said Japan's actions were completely unacceptable. He accused Tokyo of provoking China and threatening it militarily just weeks after Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi warned Japan could respond to any Chinese attack on Taiwan if Japan's security were at risk. China says Japan sent military aircraft to disrupt announced carrier-based training near the Miyako Strait. Tokyo rejects that claim, saying radar illumination by Chinese jets was a dangerous and unnecessary act. Beijing has repeatedly asserted that Taiwan is a part of China, a claim Taiwan rejects. Taipei's foreign ministry said the island has never been ruled by China and that only Taiwan's elected government can represent its 23 million people. The incident follows weeks of rising tensions as the two Asian powers trade accusations over Taiwan and regional military activity. That concludes AWANI International for tonight. Stay with us as we track the strategies and power shifts shaping the new global order. For more updates, visit international.astroawani.com and follow us on social media. I'm Farhana Sheikh. Thank you for watching and good night.